It is my distinct privilege to welcome to our conference Dr. Hicham Alaoui. A few years ago, he was called Mullah Hicham, and in English, he was referred to as Prince Hicham because he is indeed a member of a Moroccan royal family, but he has decided to forego all titles. And in the book that we're going to be talking about, in his description, it says, Hicham Alaoui is Research Associate, Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, Harvard University. But in fact, he is a lot more than that. He has done a lot more for the study of democracy. I have had the good fortune of knowing him for 15 years, enjoying his advice and counsel. He has created a center for the study of democracy in the Arab world at Stanford. A few years ago, that center convened a meeting. Proceedings of that meeting have been now published. It's called The Struggles for Political Change in the Arab World, Regimes, Oppositions, and External Actors After the Spring. I had the good fortune of being part of that panel, and my paper is included in this book that you see. And Dr. Alaoui has written a preface to this. But what we're going to mostly talk about is his more recent book called Pacted Democracy in the Middle East, Tunisia and Egypt in Comparative Perspective. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation and gracing our meeting with your presence and with your advice. Tell us a little bit about what you understand a pacted transition and a pacted democracy to be.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this dialogue, and I'm very honored to be answering your questions and to be, although not in person, but remotely among you with such a distinguished group of people. What I mean by pacted democracy, in fact, that the term, of course, is not mine. The term exists in the field of comparative politics and transitology, and it's been used to describe the transitions that have characterized the beginning of the third wave in the 70s and 80s. And by pacted democracy, we mean negotiated transitions to democracy, where a regime sensing the impasse and being kind of cornered and knowing more than a structural crisis, but almost a political, open political crisis. Or further than that, knowing on the verge of demise, that the regime decides to extricate itself and to negotiate the best terms for an exit strategy. And it does so by entering into a pact with the opposition, which is on the other side of the aisle. Now, in the context of the 80s, in the context of the early 80s and the 70s in Latin America, this essentially meant a negotiated bargain between the military on one hand, on the other hand, leftist movements usually in society. And usually it's between the moderates within the regime, within the opposition, and the softliners within the regime, and then the pact. After this initial agreement, the pact widens to include more people, and the process of institutionalization begins. So that essentially, in a word, what we mean by pact. And in my book, I basically adapt or exhume this study of pacts, and I apply them to the Middle East. I think, in all modesty, it is one of those first instances where this has been adapted or applied to the Middle East.
I don't think it's one of the first. I think it is the first, and it's the most detailed that I have seen. In fact, of pacted democracy in practice anywhere, and I've been curious about it. You and I have talked about it. Now, you've studied two. One, a failed pacted democracy, what you essentially call a failed pacted democracy in Egypt, and one that was more or less successful, at least till a few months ago, in Tunisia. What accounts for what can bring about a successful pact, and what, in your mind, can be the chief factors for a failure?
I have compared Egypt to Tunisia for a simple reason. At the time where I was conducting the research, they were essentially the only countries in the beginning of the Arab Spring 2011 to have engaged a beginning of political change and political transformation. And as you will say, one led to a transition and the other failed. Now, of course, we will talk later about Tunisia, why that transition has not completed. So this is why, I basically put these two cases on the same leveling field, and I compare them. Now, I come to the study of pacts in the region first by a simple observation, and it's an evident observation, but it's a complex one, and is namely that why haven't these transitions? Why in all of these countries that have known political eruptions, basically from below, none of them have basically known successful transformations except for Tunisia. And I started with this interrogation, and then I came to the conclusion that it was for several reasons. First, that what characterizes these transitions is that though the regimes seem to know a rupture, in fact, it wasn't the regime that knew a rupture. It was basically the elites dominating the regime at the time of the uprisings. So elites that are invisible and that are still part of the regime still could reorganize and come back to the forefront after the transition. They could wait out essentially the process of anger and of effervescence in the street and then reimpose themselves. The second observation, and it's linked also to the third, is that the mobilization was one that was very punctual. People would come out in the street and basically demand the departure of the incumbents, and lo and behold, the incumbents would leave, and then they would go back home. So essentially, these political actors were not institutionalized and did not organize themselves to be able to translate their energy into firm political agendas. And these two observations basically are the framework or the skeleton from which I depart to describe the pact. So this is what characterizes these regimes, these pacts, instead of as opposed to what characterized the pacts in Latin America and elsewhere, the pacts of the third waves, the first pact. Also, finally, another important observation is related again to these two features of the political scene, is that we have tended to conflate uprisings in the streets and the effervescence in the streets with colored revolutions, which have characterized the political landscape of the world in the past 20 years. Basically, we have hastily labeled these movements as colored revolutions, like in Eastern Europe, and they're not colored revolutions. Colored revolutions succeeded because the incumbents or the regime in power was basically the Communist Party or the successor Communist Party, and that party, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did not have the ideological means, the financial support from Moscow or from the center of the Soviet Empire, and did not have the structures to continue to stay in power. So this is why these countries, these regimes were done away with more easily, and hence we tended to conflate and to look at that model and to say, well, Tunisia is a colored revolution. It's a Jasmine revolution after all. It's not the same thing. These regimes from Eastern Europe basically are successors or belong or are extensions of the legacy of the Cold War. While as in our region, in MENA regions, Middle East and North Africa, these regimes are basically part of a legacy of the post-colonial order, which means that the elites on power are the elites that brought about the emergence of a new independent country. And as such, they were entrenched. There were those that designed the institutions that governed. There were those that fostered and incubated the networks of patronage and the economic sphere. So they had a lot of staying power, and they were just simply not going to allow themselves to be uprooted in such a way. So, and hence we were in front of a new phenomena, and that needed to be analyzed. And this is why I saw the framework of pacted transitions much more appropriated. And if we were to accommodate for certain adjustments, the theory or the model, if you will, was amenable pretty much to being operationalized intellectually, at least. Of course, it's not the complete story, but it's a contribution in that direction.
What you're saying, in a sense, fits perfectly with the conference we have. The conference is a joint effort by three groups. A group called Gozar, which is tens of Iran's top elites, technocrats, professors, lawyers. Another group called Kaya, which is a group of Iranian entrepreneurs, and the Iranian Studies program at Stanford, precisely trying to understand what does a transition require, what does it look like, why can it fail, how can it succeed. In other words, we can't just jump into it and hope for this transition. I know you follow Iran very closely. I know your family has had a long relationship with the royal family of the past. I know you yourself followed the developments. So if studying the two cases, what would be your best understanding of how a transition, a pacted transition maybe, or maybe not a pacted transition, can happen in Iran?
So first, before I address your question frontally, but cautiously, albeit because I'm not a specialist of Iran, although I read a lot about it and I have many Iranian friends, and I have been immersed in the region very much so. Let me just say the conditions of a pact. When does a pact work, and when is a pact a useful framework? A pact is a useful framework when you have basically polarization between the opposition, or let's say not the opposition in the region, but between contenders to power, challengers that challenge competitors towards power. Now, if there is polarization, there is intractable conflict. And as such, this is an inducement for bargaining. When you have parity of power, when clearly one group knows that it cannot impose its will on the other group, that's a further inducement towards pacting and towards entering into bargaining. And when you have basically diversity, when you have diversity in normative diversity, what does that mean? That means basically that two contenders agree on democracy, but they have radically different views on how to install that democracy. So these three situations are those that encourage pact. And the more these factors are persistent in a situation, the more the inducement towards pacting. Now, and this is the analysis I've applied to Tunisia and the analysis I've applied to Egypt. Tunisia had all the elements, while Egypt had all the elements except the second, parity of power. The Islamists were basically stronger than the secularists, and they did not pact with the secularists. And as such, there was a failure of pacting, which was basically an invitation for the military to come in. That's my argument. So, given this background canvas, what can one say about Iran? Well, Iran, here is the problem. You have ideological polarization. That's clearly there. You have parity in the sense that the regime can use crude force to quell the uprisings, but at the same time, they cannot uproot the uprisings. The seed is still there, and they recurrently come back to the surface. So that conflict is basically in a stalemate. And at the same time, at least for now, all the challenges the opposition have mounted, they could simply not placate definitively the regime because of the repression. And then, of course, there's normative diversity, because whatever ideas they may have about democracy, and I'm sure there are many patriots within the Iranian regime. Not all of them are, many want the good for their nation. And within the opposition, they're going to have essentially differences that cannot be sorted out, unless around a table. So that is the canvas for pacting. Now, but let's take it further. It's important that there be acute polarization. The more polarization there is, the more inducement for the pact. But this is not to say that beyond a certain point, that polarization becomes counterproductive. And it seems to me that in Iran, we have not acute polarization, we have severe polarization, in the sense that too much blood has basically been spilled, and there has been too much violence and too much repression, and as such, many in the opposition, many in society, basically are past the point of pacting. And a good indication to that is that many people in Iran, it seems to me, correct me please, don't see the benefit in continuing the electoral game. After all, they voted Rafsanjani in, after all, they voted other reformers in, and the result has been the same. So they're not willing to play the game of gradualism all the time. So the danger is that this, in the first criteria, this extreme polarization is such, it's not acute anymore, it's extreme, it's more than severe, it's really basically irreconcilable. And as such, we have passed the point of no return concerning the pact. Now, plausibly, there could be another view, that at the end of the day, no. I can imagine a situation where there are fault lines within the regime. And again, you and your colleagues that will be debating this in Stanford would know this better than I. But as an observer, I can imagine that there may be severe fractures, cleavages within the security services in Iran. There might be a big break between the army of the Pasdarans and the normal troops. And at a certain moment, the means of violence could not be unleashed openly, against protesters. And at some point, the armed forces, a big bulk of the armed forces, which are not the spearhead of the clerical regime, say, no, that's enough. If this were to happen, then I can imagine that between these new forces that emerge within the security apparatus and society, there could be the emergence of a pact saying, well, now we can sit down together as patriots who love Iran and know, as people who are cognizant, that continued stalemate can be mutually destructive. Because this is one of the reasons why these pacts work. It's when mutual stalemate is destructive, and the path of least cost becomes negotiation. And at that point, one can imagine, the beginning of a negotiation.
I think some of the signs of that cleavage are clearly evident. Mousavi, who was for 8 years Khomeini's favorite prime minister, issued a statement basically saying this regime is finished, and unless we can get a new social contract, a new agreement with the people, it's not going to work. And there are other signs. The security forces, we haven't seen any sign of erosion, but I think it might not be long before we see that. But I have to ask a relevant question that is related to Pact. I think the book you wrote before Pacted Democracy, not the book you edited on the education system, where it was really a brilliant book where he and his colleagues showed that how authoritarian regimes refashioned their curriculum, academic curriculum, educational curriculum, to contain this democratic aspiration. But you also wrote something about the royal family in Morocco. I read that book. I think it's one of the wisest books I have read about how a monarchy can survive in a democracy. In a sense, that book is, long before you talked about pacted transition, correct me if I'm wrong, is about how the monarchy can be part of a pacted transition in a country like Morocco. Am I right in understanding that? If I'm right, how do you think that's possible?
I'm very proud of that book. Thank you for mentioning it, and thank you for giving it the praise that you do. But I pretty much still think all everything that I've wrote with a single proviso, with a single caveat. If a monarchy, or if a suprastructure, or if a tutelary structure, more call it, the clerical, the institution of wilayat al-faqih, for example, in Iran, or the army in Tunisia. The problem with this is that such tutelary powers or enclaves of power complicate the pact, because they do not invalidate it. I don't think so, because at the end of the day, when there is eruption, there will be enough pressure on that institution, which plays basically the role of tutor on the society. If there's enough pressure on it, it will basically retreat back and play the role of arbitration. So I have not abandoned that altogether. But then at the end of the day, there still has to be a pact between the opposing society parties in society. But one cannot count on that tutelary power, whether it's a monarchy or the army, to be enlightened. You can have an enlightened monarch. A monarch can be enlightened based on his experience. He knows at the end of the day that a centrally planned economy is at the end of the day detrimental, and at the end of the day, if there's no accountability, there's no solution for the equal distribution of the benefits of the economy, and you have widening gaps between the haves and the have-nots, and it's an unstable situation. But short of that, short of somebody who's in power for 20, 30 years and acquires that astuteness and that wisdom, the tutelary power cannot automatically be assumed that it will relinquish power. This is why pressure is always a very important part of that pact. And this is my argument in Egypt, that it was on the defensive after the Egyptian army was on the defensive. But the lack of a pact between the political contenders, i.e. Islamists on the one hand and seculars on the other hand, essentially gave the army the incentive to reconquer the power it's lost. The Egyptian military did not set up the transition to fail. It was the failure of the actors that brought in the military and that made the military clamp down. Add to that, of course, the negative geopolitical forces. Now, in my book, I talk about seculars and Islamists, that this is the main fracture line in these societies. Now, there's a big nuance in Iran. We can say, well, is it really the cleavage? And that's something I know you will try to tackle in your conference. For me, just because there is a mounting and overwhelming opposition against the clerical establishment, it does not mean that that there's no place for Islamists and that they will not be at the table in a future pact if there is a pact. Why? I have been intrigued and I have been really puzzled by seeing how many veiled women come out to the streets in Iran helping and supporting their sisters without the veil. And for me, that's a clear message. We don't have a problem with the veil as such. We have a problem with a structure that instrumentalizes religion to hold on to power. That is how I see the situation in Iran. It's not so much the veil; it's that the veil has become the linchpin to the situation, to basically to the breaking of the resistance of that wall, and the regime knows it. And it's my sense that the regime could have very well sacrificed the veil in the name of religion, in the name of a reinterpretation of religion. It would still keep for itself the prerogative of holding on and of deliberating and adjudicating on matter of religion. But it doesn't do it because it feels that if it concedes there, it will basically have to concede on everything else.
I think that's exactly the case, and there are people within the establishment, most importantly Khamenei himself, who says the hijab is God's right, we are here to enforce God's writ, and there are people who, I think, contrary to the claims of Velayat Faqih, are saying that religion can play an important role in the social life, in the private life of the individuals, and I think one of the challenges for any possible pact in Iran is precisely how people negotiate that role, that what you call in your book sort of religion light role. But Velayat Faqih, as you know, absolutely, categorically denies even the desirability of democracy. It says we are guardians of Allah on earth, we guide. But there were other clerics from the time of the Constitutional Revolution who said exactly what you were trying to argue, that there is a place for it, but if you understand your limit and if you understand that there's a social contract between people who allows them to make their decisions in conjunction, but not constrained by religion. I am, again, extremely grateful for the time you gave us. It was, as always, every time I chat with you, I learned a great deal, and every time I chat with you, I think that the Middle East can be a democratic place if it has people like you who are willing to put your time, who are willing to put your money, who are willing to put your expertise in the service of democracy, who are willing to forego royal titles if that helps promote the democratic aspirations. Every time I meet a Moroccan and there is a talk of Morocco, there's almost invariably talk of you as a beacon of hope for Moroccan democracy. So I'm honored and very grateful that you accepted my invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and the honor is mine, and I wish your conference is successful. I look forward to following, to seeing the videos that ensue. And beyond all of that, I pray for a prosperous, stable Iran in the framework of a free order, where society is free and where the institutions are democratic. And thank you very much. And I think, as you would say in your rich language and culture, Khoda Hafiz.
Khoda Hafiz. Thank you.